I didn't even read the first line at first. I saw the paper clipped to my mailbox like a trophy, the kind of bright, official-looking notice that's designed to make your stomach drop before you process a single word. The bold header, the formal spacing, the way it was angled just enough that anyone walking past could see it, like it wanted an audience. And the thought that hit me hard and immediate wasn't anger. It was, if this is really a final notice, can I force due process after the HOA's final notice? Or are they about to steamroll me because they think I'll panic? Because in our neighborhood, panic was the point. Panic made people fold. Panic made them pay. Panic made them rip out whatever the board had decided was non-compliant that week. I took the paper down carefully, like it might bite. I didn't tear it off. I didn't crumple it. I didn't even let my fingers smudge it. I held it by the edges and walked inside as if I'd just been handed a fragile piece of evidence. That was the first decision I made that day. Treat it like proof, not an insult. The second decision was easier. I sat at my kitchen table with the notice flat in front of me, a pen beside it, and my phone camera ready. I photographed it from above, close enough to catch every word, and then again with the date and time on my screen reflected in the glass. I saved the images twice, in 2 different folders. I emailed them to myself with a simple subject line so I could find them later. Then I read it. Final notice. The Homeowners Association demanded I remove my garden. Not trim it. Not adjust it. Not bring it into compliance. Remove it. As if it was garbage. As if it was a broken appliance left on the curb. As if it hadn't been there, thriving for months. The notice cited a violation of community standards and unapproved landscaping modifications. It referenced a section of the CCRs, but not the full wording. It didn't include a photograph. It didn't include a prior warning. It didn't include a hearing date. It didn't include anything I would expect from a process that was supposed to be fair. It included an order. It included a threat. And it included, stamped in a way that was meant to feel final, 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 the same 2 words repeated in smaller print. No extensions. I stared at it until the black letters blurred slightly. Then I got up, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I knew exactly what would happen if I stayed sitting. I would start drafting furious replies in my head. I would pace. I would imagine the board members' smug faces. I would start reacting. And reacting emotionally, reacting publicly, reacting quickly, was how the HOA got you. So instead, I made coffee. I forced my hands to do something slow and routine. I looked out the window at my garden, bright even under the thin morning cloud cover. It wasn't a wild jungle. It wasn't a front yard farm. It was tidy, structured, and planned. A clean rectangle of raised beds along the side yard where the sun hit best. A few flowering borders. Nothing that blocked sidewalks. Nothing that damaged property. Nothing that reached into common space. It was also the first thing I'd done for myself after a rough year of feeling like everything was out of my control. That wasn't dramatic. It was just true. The garden was my quiet rebellion against stress. I'd started it after moving in, when the house still felt unfamiliar and the neighbors still felt like strangers. Digging my hands into soil had made the place feel like mine. Apparently, that was the problem. Because the HOA didn't care about meaning. The HOA cared about authority. And there was one neighbor in particular who cared about both. I had noticed her before I learned her name. I didn't need anyone to tell me who she was. She had that look, the tight smile, the crisp posture, the way she walked the neighborhood like she owned the pavement. She had a habit of pausing at corners as if expecting people to step aside for her. She didn't wave. She watched. The first time she saw my garden, she didn't comment on the flowers or ask what I was planting. She stood at the edge of my yard with her arms crossed and scanned it like an inspector. I'd been kneeling, pulling weeds. Dirt on my knees, gloves on my hands, feeling weirdly peaceful. I looked up and caught her gaze. I nodded. A polite, normal neighbor gesture. She didn't nod back. Instead, she pointed with one finger at the raised bed like it was evidence of a crime. She said something I couldn't hear over the hum of a lawn mower down the street, but her tone was sharp. The kind of tone that didn't ask questions, it delivered judgments. I just smiled, because I had no interest in starting something with a stranger. I went back to my weeds. That was the moment, looking back, where the whole thing began. Not with the notice. Not with the board. With her. Because a week later, I got my first letter from the HO, gentler, but still stiff. It referenced unapproved modifications. It asked me to submit documentation for any changes to my front-facing landscaping. Front-facing. Even though my beds were off to the side, not visible from the street unless you were looking for them. I had gone through the proper channels. I'd filled out the architectural request form. I'd attached photos. I'd even included a rough sketch showing placement. I'd quoted the relevant CCR language I'd found, which was mostly about fences, permanent structures, and major grading. Landscaping rules were vague, full of words like harmonious and appropriate and consistent with community aesthetics. I'd submitted everything and waited. And waited. No response. Then, suddenly, another letter arrived. This time it said my garden was not approved and must be brought into compliance. Still no hearing. Still no direct process. Just instructions. I had responded in writing, calmly, asking for clarification. I asked which specific rule it violated and how the board determined non-compliance. I asked what the appeal process was. I asked when my request had been reviewed and by whom. 2 days later, I got a reply. Not an answer. A brush-off. It said the board had discretion and that I should comply promptly. It didn't include the vote. It didn't include an agenda excerpt. It didn't include anything that showed my request had actually been considered. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with simple bureaucracy. I was dealing with a homeowners association drama machine, powered by petty control and one neighbor who seemed to enjoy watching it run. And now, months later, I was staring at a final notice that skipped every step that should come before final. I went outside and walked the perimeter of my garden slowly, like I was surveying a scene. I took photos from multiple angles. I got shots that showed it didn't block anything. I got shots that showed it was maintained. I got shots that showed it was no different, in spirit, than the decorative planters other people had. Because yes, other people had planters. Flower beds. Yard ornaments. A few had rock features and decorative edging that looked far more modified than mine. But those weren't being targeted. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't about the garden. This was about setting an example. There's a kind of pressure that builds in an HOA neighborhood that isn't quite fear and isn't quite anger. It's a constant hum of, don't be the one who gets singled out. Don't be the one people whisper about. Don't be the one with a notice on your mailbox. And that pressure is exactly why a public final notice is such a weapon. Because it turns the neighborhood into the audience. It turns your yard into a stage. And suddenly, everyone is watching to see whether you obey. As I took photos, I noticed a movement across the street. Someone's blinds shifted. Someone's dog barked. A garage door rose halfway and stopped, as if the owner thought better of stepping outside. People knew what that notice meant. People knew what the board did to homeowners who pushed back. This wasn't my first run-in with the HOA, but it was my first time being targeted with something that felt coordinated. And that's when I stopped thinking about the garden. I started thinking about the process. Because if the HOA wanted a quick surrender, I was going to do the opposite. I was going to slow everything down, and I was going to do it in a way they couldn't call non-compliant behavior. No yelling. No drama. No public scene. Just paper. I went back inside and pulled out the thick folder I kept in a kitchen cabinet, the one I'd started when the first letter arrived. It had copies of every notice, every response, every photograph, every form. I flipped through it like I was checking my own memory against reality. There was my original submission form. There were the photos I'd attached. There was the date stamp from the HOA portal showing it had been received. There was their vague response. There was my calm follow-up request for clarification. There was their brush-off. And now there was the final notice, sitting on top like a guillotine blade. I added the new photographs behind it. Then I started a new section in the folder with a label written in plain marker, due process. That phrase mattered. It mattered because it was one thing the HOA didn't like hearing. Boards loved rules when rules gave them power. They hated rules when rules limited them. I opened the community documents online and downloaded the CCRs again, even though I already had them. I wanted the most recent version, the one they couldn't claim was outdated. I searched for landscaping language, for enforcement procedure, for hearing requirements. I found sections about notice, opportunity to be heard, and the board's obligation to follow internal steps before issuing penalties. The language wasn't dramatic. It was dry. But it was there. I printed those pages. Then, because I knew paper alone could still become a he said she said, I pulled up the last meeting agenda the HOA had posted. Most homeowners never looked at those agendas. They assumed it was boring. They assumed it wasn't their business. They assumed the board was just handling routine stuff. But agendas were a map of what the board wanted to do and what they wanted to hide. Sure enough, I found an agenda excerpt that listed landscaping enforcement as a discussion item. No details. No addresses. Just a phrase. But it was enough to show this wasn't random. It was planned. I printed that too. Then I drafted a letter. Not a complaint. Not a rant. Not a desperate plea. A procedural request. I kept it clean and formal. I acknowledged receipt of the final notice. I requested the full CCR language being cited, not a vague reference. I requested the date my prior submission had been reviewed and the outcome of that review. I requested the enforcement timeline and the hearing process. I requested any photographs or reports used to determine violation. And most importantly, I requested confirmation that enforcement actions would be paused until due process steps were completed. I knew that last part would annoy them. But annoyance wasn't illegal. I attached copies of my original submission and the acknowledgement timestamp. I attached the relevant CCR section regarding hearing. I attached the agenda excerpt. I wasn't threatening them. I was backing them into a corner with their own paperwork. This was the part of the story most people skip in their heads because it feels boring compared to confrontation. But in an HOA nightmare, paper is the confrontation. A week of quiet documentation can do more damage to the board's control than a loud argument ever could. I printed 2 copies of the letter and signed both. I put one in my folder. I put the other in an envelope. Then I drove to the management office and dropped it off in person. The receptionist gave me the kind of smile people give when they can tell you're a problem, meaning you're not going to roll over politely. I didn't argue. I didn't ask to speak to the manager. I didn't try to corner anyone into a conversation. I just asked for a date-stamped receipt. There was a pause. A slight hesitation. Then she did it. And when I walked back to my car with that stamped receipt in my hand, I felt something shift. Not relief. Momentum. Because now there was a paper trail they couldn't erase. Back home, my phone buzzed with a notification from the HOA portal. A message had been posted. I opened it expecting a generic response. Instead, it was a short note, clipped and dismissive, telling me compliance was expected and that the board's decision was final. No answers. No hearing. No photos. No acknowledgement of my earlier submission. Just the same attitude wrapped in different words. But now it was in writing. And written dismissal, when someone is required to follow procedure, is the kind of thing that comes back to haunt them. I added a screenshot to the folder. Then I did something that felt petty but was entirely strategic. I walked through the neighborhood and photographed other landscaping features that were more intrusive than mine. Not secretly. Not like a spy. I walked openly, phone in hand, taking wide shots from the sidewalk. Decorative borders. Raised planters. Stacked stone edges. A small vegetable patch behind a low picket fence. All the kinds of things that, if the board actually cared about aesthetics, would be consistent targets. But these weren't being targeted because the board didn't actually care about uniformity. They cared about obedience. And I cared about proof. Around mid-afternoon, I saw her again, the neighbor who had started this. She was walking slowly, deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world to monitor other people's property. She spotted me with my phone. Her pace changed. She angled toward me, not friendly, not casual. Her mouth moved as if she was saying something pointed, something that probably sounded like, "You can't do that," or, "The board is done with you," or, "You're making this worse." I didn't respond verbally. I smiled politely, as if she just commented on the weather. Then I turned my phone slightly so she could see I wasn't photographing her. I was photographing a row of identical planters across the street. And I watched her face tighten with frustration as she realized she wasn't the center of the scene. That tiny moment told me everything. She wanted drama. She wanted me to snap. She wanted me to be the homeowner who gave her a story to tell. Instead, I gave her silence and paperwork. That night, I sat down with my folder again and created a simple timeline. Dates of notices. Dates of responses. Dates of my submissions. Screenshots, printed and labeled. I wasn't building a case for court. This wasn't legal advice. This was a case for the HOA's own internal accountability, the kind they pretended to have. Because if the board was skipping steps, the one thing they feared wasn't me yelling. It was me showing other homeowners that procedure wasn't being followed. That's what turns a private enforcement action into a board problem. And once the board had a problem, they'd need to control the narrative fast. That's why, the next morning, I wasn't surprised when another notification came through. A new message, this one more formal, stated that an inspection would be conducted to verify compliance. No hearing. No pause. No answers to my procedural requests. Just inspection. That word always sounded harmless to people who hadn't lived through HOA harassment. But in this context, inspection wasn't about information. Inspection was about power. It was the board saying, we don't have to explain ourselves. We can just show up and decide. And as I read that message, the suspense shifted into something sharper. Because if they were sending an inspection without due process, they were either reckless, or they were trying to create a moment they could document to justify action. I stood at my window and looked out at my garden, bright in the morning sun, perfectly maintained. And I realized something that made my pulse spike. They weren't just coming to look. They were coming to set a trap. I stayed calm, but my mind started moving faster. An inspection request without addressing my procedural letter wasn't just sloppy. It was deliberate. It was them trying to skip straight to a photo op of non-compliance, so they could claim they had verified the violation and push the next step without ever giving me a fair chance to be heard. And if they got their verification, then the final notice stopped being a piece of paper and started becoming an excuse. So I did what I'd been doing all along. I turned their move into documentation. First, I screenshot the inspection message the moment I saw it. Then I emailed it to myself with the subject line, Inspection Notice HOA Portal. I printed it. I added it to the folder. Then I pulled out the due process section and read my own letter again to make sure I didn't drift into emotion. I didn't. That was important, because this was the part where the HOA counted on homeowners making mistakes. People argued face to face. People said things they regretted. People did something in frustration that could be framed as refusal to cooperate. I wasn't going to give them a single sentence they could twist. Instead, I drafted a new written response through the portal. It was short and boring on purpose. I acknowledged their inspection message. I asked for the scope of the inspection, the criteria being used, and confirmation of the board's authority to enter the relevant area. I reiterated my pending request for a hearing and asked whether the inspection was intended to replace that process. Then I added one line that was calm but sharp. I requested that any inspection findings be provided to me in writing with photographs and that no enforcement action proceed until I had an opportunity to respond. I hit send. If they wanted to be aggressive, they'd have to do it on the record. Then I did something that felt almost ridiculous but was exactly what I needed. I treated my garden like a staged exhibit. I took photos of it again, but this time I included a few specific angles that showed boundaries clearly. The property line. The distance from the sidewalk. The fact that nothing was encroaching. I took a wide shot that included the house number on the curb in the frame, not because I wanted to share it, but because it anchored the photo in time and place for my own record. Then I walked inside and grabbed the printed CCR pages I'd already highlighted. The section about notice. The section about opportunity to be heard. The section that described the board's duty to apply standards consistently. I kept them ready on the kitchen counter like a script I didn't intend to read aloud, because I wasn't going to have a conversation with inspectors. I was going to have a file. That afternoon, the air in the neighborhood felt different. Maybe it was just my nerves, but it felt like people were watching more. Like news had spread, the way it always did when the HOA decided to make an example. There's something about being singled out in a homeowners association drama that turns you into public property. People don't have to know your name to recognize the signs. They see the notice. They see the tension. They see the cautious posture and the extra trips in and out of the house as you prepare for something you never asked for. I caught a neighbor looking away too quickly when I made eye contact. I caught another neighbor slowing down on their evening walk as they passed my garden, their gaze flicking from the plants to my front door. And then I saw her again. The neighbor who had started this. She wasn't on her usual patrol route. She was positioned, standing near the corner where she could see my driveway, my side yard, and the street leading into the neighborhood. She wasn't pretending to take a walk. She was waiting. For a moment, I imagined what she wanted. She wanted the inspectors to arrive, she wanted me outside, she wanted a scene. She wanted the satisfaction of seeing someone else forced to obey. It was classic Karen neighbor drama, except she never had to raise her voice. The HOA did it for her. I stayed inside. I didn't hide, but I didn't step into her stage. When the inspection day arrived, I woke up early and did something that surprised even me. I watered the garden. Not because it needed it, but because it reminded me that I wasn't fighting for a patch of soil. I was fighting for the idea that I had a right to be treated fairly in my own home. And because it grounded me. Literally. By mid-morning, a car I didn't recognize rolled slowly down the street and stopped near my house. Another followed. Two people got out with clipboards and that stiff, professional posture that always makes things feel more official than they really are. They didn't come to the front door first. They walked toward the side yard. Of course they did. I stayed inside, but I didn't disappear. I stood by the window where I could see them without being seen. Not because I was scared, because I wanted to document exactly what they did. I filmed from inside. Just a steady shot. No commentary. No shaky panic. I captured them walking, stopping, taking photos. One of them leaned slightly toward the bed and pointed, like they were noting something. Another made a mark on their clipboard. They were there for less than 10 minutes. Then they left without knocking. No introduction. No explanation. No chance for me to provide context. No opportunity to ask what they were looking at. It felt like a raid designed to leave you feeling powerless. But the truth was, they'd just given me something useful, proof that they conducted an inspection without any homeowner involvement and without responding to my due process request. That evening, I got the results through the portal. It was a single paragraph. It stated the garden remained in violation. It stated removal was required. It stated further action would be taken if I did not comply. No photos. No criteria. No explanation. Just an assertion. I added the message screenshot to the folder and printed it. Then I did the thing that most people don't do because they assume it won't matter. I requested the inspection report. In writing. I asked for the photographs taken, the checklist used, and the standards being applied. I also requested, again, a hearing date. This time, I referenced the exact CCR section number in my message, the one that described notice and opportunity to be heard. I kept it respectful. I kept it concise. I kept it unarguable. And then I waited. 24 hours passed with no response. Then another day. Then, suddenly, a new item appeared on the HOA's posted meeting agenda online. A tiny bullet point under New Business. Landscaping enforcement. The same vague phrase as before, but it was listed again. That was the moment where my strategy clicked into place. Because if they were putting landscaping enforcement on the agenda, then my situation was being discussed at a board meeting. Which meant there would be minutes. Which meant there would be votes. Which meant there would be a record. And if they were doing all of this without giving me a hearing, they were setting themselves up for a procedure violation that could become public in the only place HOAs truly fear, among the other homeowners. So I made my next move. I didn't post about it. I didn't gossip. I didn't knock on doors and ask for sympathy. I did something quieter and far more effective. I requested the meeting minutes. Not just the upcoming meeting but the last meeting as well. In writing, I asked for the excerpt that referenced my property, if any, and I asked for the board's decision record regarding my submitted application. I wasn't demanding. I was requesting, like someone who understood that these were community records. Because they were. The response came quicker this time, but it wasn't what I expected. Instead of sending minutes, the HOA management replied with a short statement that meeting minutes were not available at this time, and that decisions were internal board matters. Internal board matters. That phrase did something strange to me. It made me smile, because it told me they were nervous. If they weren't worried, they'd just ignore me or send a generic copy. But claiming that community governance records were off-limits was a mistake, the kind that looks bad when anyone else hears it. And that was my opening. I responded with a single, calm follow-up. I asked them to confirm in writing that they were refusing to provide meeting minutes and refusing to provide the record of my application review. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I just asked for confirmation. They didn't reply. That silence was as valuable as a confession. At this point, the pressure started shifting. I could feel it. Not in dramatic explosions, but in tiny signs. A neighbor paused longer near the community bulletin board. Someone asked me casually how things were going, their tone too careful. A different neighbor mentioned in passing that the board seemed really active lately, as if testing whether I'd say more. And the neighbor who started it all? She got bolder. One afternoon, I came home to find another notice taped near my mailbox, positioned the same way as the final notice had been. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was a handwritten note. No signature. Just a few lines of neat, sharp writing that made it obvious who had left it, even without a name. It implied I was dragging the neighborhood down. It implied the board had every right to force compliance. It implied I was selfish for fighting. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't illegal. It was social pressure. And social pressure is one of the HOA's favorite tools, because it doesn't have to be official to work. I photographed the note immediately and added it to the file. Then I did something else. I stopped seeing it as harassment and started seeing it as proof of a coordinated campaign. Because if a neighbor was leaving anonymous notes and the board was skipping procedure, that wasn't random coincidence. That was a pattern. I wasn't going to accuse anyone. I wasn't going to create drama. But I was going to create a record. The next board meeting date arrived, and I made sure I had everything ready. Not a speech. Not a confrontation. A written request. I submitted a formal request through the portal asking to attend and speak during homeowner comment, specifically regarding enforcement procedure and the status of my hearing request. I didn't mention my garden by name in the subject line. I kept it general, procedural clarification. Because I wasn't walking into that meeting as the homeowner begging for mercy. I was walking in as the homeowner asking why the board wasn't following its own rules. The HOA responded late in the day. They said homeowner comment would be limited. They said the meeting was administrative. They suggested I submit my concerns in writing instead. In other words, don't show up. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already suspected. They didn't want me visible in that room. Because if I was visible, then other homeowners might start asking why I was there. They might ask what happened. They might ask what procedure was skipped. And once homeowners start asking questions, the board's authority starts to look less like leadership and more like control. So I did exactly what they suggested. I submitted my concerns in writing. But I did it in a way that made it impossible to bury. I wrote a short, bullet-pointed letter outlining the timeline. I attached my original application submission. I attached the date-stamped receipt. I attached the final notice photo. I attached the inspection message, the inspection result message, and my request for the report. I attached the relevant CCR section about hearings. I attached the agenda excerpt showing landscaping enforcement. I didn't accuse them of wrongdoing. I didn't use emotional language. I didn't demand that anyone be punished. I requested 3 simple things: confirmation that a hearing would be scheduled, the inspection report with photographs, and the record of how my prior application had been reviewed and decided. Then I saved it as a PDF and uploaded it through the portal. And I emailed the HOA management with the same PDF attached, using a calm subject line, procedural clarification request, landscaping enforcement. 2 channels. 1 message. 1 record. If they ignored it, it would be obvious. The next morning, I got a reply. It was longer than anything they'd sent me before. It said they would review my request. It said they would consider scheduling a hearing. It said they would attempt to locate the relevant documents. Attempt to locate. As if meeting minutes were misplaced socks. As if the inspection photos had vanished. As if the decision record didn't exist. But it was the first time they'd acknowledged the word hearing at all. That meant the pressure was working. Still, they were trying to stall. And stalling is what HOAs do when they're trying to get you tired, to make you quit. That's the part that breaks people. Not the notice. Not the inspection. The slow grind of feeling like you're stuck in an endless loop with an entity that never has to explain itself. But I'd already decided I wouldn't quit. So I made one more quiet move, the one that made this story turn from stressful to satisfying. I requested the HOA's records request policy. Not the CCRs. Not the bylaws. The actual policy for how homeowners could request documents. Because I knew it existed. It had to. The board didn't create power out of thin air. It created it through procedures and paperwork. And if there was a policy, I could follow it exactly, while also showing in the clearest possible way that the board was refusing transparency. They replied the next day with a short attachment. A 1-page document with rules about requesting records. It specified timelines. It specified what could be requested. It specified how responses would be provided. And it specified something that made my heart beat faster. It stated that meeting minutes and records related to enforcement decisions were available upon request. I stared at that line like it was glowing. Because it meant the board had been lying, or at least misrepresenting, when they said minutes were internal board matters. I printed the policy and highlighted that line. Then I did the simplest thing I'd done in weeks. I submitted a records request using their exact form, quoting their own policy language, and requesting the meeting minutes and enforcement decision record related to my property. No emotion. No drama. Just, per your policy, I am requesting these documents. And I included a deadline from their policy timeline, because that was the point of having one. I submitted it. I saved a copy. I printed the confirmation. And then I waited. This time, the silence didn't feel like helplessness. It felt like a countdown. Because the board had spent weeks acting like they could do whatever they wanted. Now they were about to discover what it felt like to be trapped by their own paperwork. The response finally came late on the last day of their policy timeline. A message appeared in the portal with a single attachment. I opened it expecting a partial response, a redacted mess, something designed to give me as little as possible. Instead, the PDF contained meeting minutes. And in those minutes, tucked into a bland paragraph under New Business, was a reference to my garden. Not by name, not by address, but by description. And it stated that my application had never been formally reviewed because a board member recommended enforcement first. Enforcement first. Not procedure. Not review. Not due process. Just enforcement. My pulse jumped, not from rage, but from clarity. Because that one line proved everything. It proved they skipped the review. It proved they chose punishment over process. It proved the final notice wasn't the end of a fair sequence, it was the beginning of a power play. And now I had it in writing. I sat back in my chair and looked at the printed pages on my table. This was the turning point. The moment where the board stopped being an untouchable force and became a group of people who could be held accountable. And I realized, with a slow, steady satisfaction, that my next step wouldn't be a fight. It would be a mirror. I would show them their own actions in their own words, and force them to explain.